A billionaire screamed at a waitress in front of a packed restaurant, but she hit back with just one calm sentence. It silenced everyone, including him. "You won't believe what she said." It started with a slam. The sound of a wine glass hitting the marble table echoed through the luxurious restaurant, slicing through the soft hum of conversation and the gentle clink of silverware. Every head turned toward the source of the disruption. The usually composed ambience of the five-star restaurant Chateau Noir was instantly pierced by tension. At the center of it all stood Richard Langston, a name recognized across the globe. A tech billionaire, the founder and CEO of Langston Dynamics, and one of the most powerful men in the business world. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his wristwatch alone was worth more than most people's cars. He was seated at a private table with several of his top executives, midway through a high-stakes dinner meeting. Richard's reputation preceded him. He was brilliant, yes, but also infamously hot-headed. Waitstaff whispered his name in fear when they saw it on the reservation list. His mood could swing without warning, and when it did, someone always paid the price, usually someone without power or a voice. But tonight, things were about to take a very unexpected turn. Across from Richard stood Maya, a young black waitress. Slender, calm, and composed, Maya looked no older than 25. She wore the restaurant's crisp black and white uniform, her name tag sitting neatly above her heart. While others in her position might have withered under the sharp glare of a furious billionaire, Maya did not flinch. She did not blink. She stood tall, her posture respectful yet unshaken. Her hands were steady, her face neutral but not passive. Moments earlier, Maya had politely informed Mr. Langston that the wine he had ordered, a rare vintage Bordeaux, was currently out of stock. She had offered a carefully selected alternative, something similar in flavor and quality, approved by the restaurant's sommelier. It was part of her job to manage such situations with grace. But Richard had not taken the news well. His voice boomed as he leaned forward. "Unacceptable," he said, slamming the empty wine glass on the table hard enough to startle the nearby diners. "What kind of place runs out of its most exclusive wine?" Maya had tried to respond calmly. "I understand the frustration, sir, but we—" He cut her off with a wave of his hand, his voice now louder, his tone sharper. "You understand? No, you don't understand. You're just a waitress. Do you even know who I am?" The question hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge, a declaration, a warning. The implication was clear. He was powerful and she was not. He could ruin her with a phone call. He could buy this restaurant and fire her on the spot. There was a pause, the kind that stretches for miles in the span of seconds. The entire restaurant had gone silent. Even the kitchen doors had stopped swinging. Phones lowered. Forks froze midair. Eyes darted between the billionaire and the waitress. And yet Maya stood her ground. She looked Richard Langston in the eye, not with defiance but with calm clarity. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft but carried through the room like thunder. "Yes, I know who you are," she said. "But I also know who I am." It was just one sentence. 12 words. But they struck harder than any raised voice or slammed glass. Richard blinked. He wasn't used to this. People didn't talk back to him, certainly not like this and certainly not in public. He was used to obedience, fear, deference, but not quiet strength. Something shifted in his expression. The anger that had been burning in his eyes flickered, dulled, and gave way to something unfamiliar, reflection. For a long second he said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair, ran a hand across his chin and nodded. "Just once." "Fair enough," he muttered, and gestured for his assistant to handle the wine situation. He didn't raise his voice again that night. Maya finished the rest of her shift as usual. She continued taking orders, checking on tables, refilling glasses. When the manager approached her later that evening, visibly worried about the confrontation, she smiled and said she was fine. And she was. What no one knew at that moment was that Maya wasn't just any waitress. She was working her way through business school at the local community college. She had dreams, big ones. She wasn't waiting tables because she had no other option. She was doing it because she was disciplined, focused, and driven. She had a vision. To launch her own business, to create a space where people like her could rise without having to shrink in the face of power. 2 days later, a sleek black car pulled up outside Maya's apartment. A professionally dressed man stepped out and handed her an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. To Maya, "You reminded me of something I lost a long time ago. You weren't loud, but you were powerful. If you ever need a door opened, Langston Enterprises will open one for you. Richard Langston." Maya appreciated the gesture, but she didn't take the offer. She had other plans that didn't require walking through someone else's door. She would build her own. 3 years later, Maya launched her consulting firm, helping young entrepreneurs from underserved communities access resources, mentorship, and funding. Her company grew quickly, respected for its integrity and its impact. One of her earliest contracts came from an unexpected source, Langston Enterprises. Maya had turned a moment of intimidation into a milestone of empowerment. Not by shouting, not by retaliating, but by knowing who she was. Because sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one that refuses to be shaken. Before we get to that one sentence, let's rewind a little. Maya was no ordinary waitress. She had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunities were few and obstacles were everywhere. Raised by her mother, a woman who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on and food on the table, Maya knew from an early age what it meant to struggle, but also what it meant to rise. Her mother had always told her, "It's not where you start, it's where you choose to go." And Maya took those words seriously. Life had never handed her anything. Every bit of progress she made came from discipline, sacrifice, and focus. While her peers were partying, Maya was grinding. Studying by candlelight during power outages, picking up extra shifts on weekends, and applying for every scholarship she could find. Despite the odds, she managed to get accepted into a respected community college's business program. Her dream wasn't small. She wanted to launch a company of her own, something innovative, something that gave back, something that broke the cycle so many others were stuck in. But dreams cost money. That's why, between classes, Maya worked part-time as a waitress at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, Chateau Noir. It was the kind of place where dinner for 2 could cost more than her monthly rent, and the walls were lined with art so expensive it didn't have price tags, just insurance policies. Celebrities came here to be seen. Politicians came here to negotiate in quiet corners. CEOs booked out entire wings to entertain foreign investors. Maya, despite her youth, had earned a reputation as one of the best servers on staff. She remembered faces, orders, dietary restrictions, and tiny details like whether a guest liked lemon in their water or not. But more than that, she carried herself with poise. She never appeared rushed, never seemed overwhelmed, even when the pressure was at its highest. Her coworkers often wondered how she stayed so calm. The truth was, Maya had already been through more difficult moments than most people twice her age. A rude customer wasn't going to shake her. A delayed order wasn't going to break her. And even when someone threw their wealth or title around like a weapon, she remained grounded. She knew who she was, and that knowledge was her armor. But Richard Langston was a different challenge altogether. He wasn't just wealthy, he was billionaire wealthy. The kind of man who could make or break a company with a single tweet. He was featured in financial magazines, invited to speak at elite conferences, and held on a pedestal by entrepreneurs across the globe. But behind the glossy headlines was a man known for his cruelty to those beneath him. In the service industry, his name was often passed around like a warning. He doesn't tolerate mistakes. He once made a hostess cry and demanded she be fired. Watch your tone, he'll notice. Staff would whisper those things when he made a reservation. And when his name showed up on the booking list, a quiet tension filled the room. When he walked into Chateau Noir that evening, it was like a storm cloud settling over the restaurant. His presence was powerful, magnetic even. He was flanked by 2 executives and his personal assistant, all nodding obediently as he talked loudly about business deals, global expansion, and his latest acquisition. From the moment he arrived, it was clear that this dinner was more than a meal. It was a show. Richard wanted control, and everything around him was expected to revolve in perfect orbit. Maya had been assigned to his table. She didn't ask for it, but she didn't object either. She approached with the same grace she offered every table, polite, efficient, and respectful. For a while everything was smooth. She took their drink orders, brought out the appetizers, and answered a few technical questions about the menu. She noticed quickly how Richard spoke over people, how he interrupted his own assistant, and how he treated the other servers like they weren't even there. Still, Maya remained professional. She didn't react. She never showed any discomfort. If anything, her poise only made her stand out more. But then came the wine. Richard had ordered a very specific bottle, a rare vintage Bordeaux imported from a private vineyard in France. Unfortunately, a shipping delay had caused a temporary shortage, and the restaurant was completely out of it. Maya had been briefed before service began and was prepared with a recommended alternative. Another vintage, equally impressive, with a near-identical flavor profile. She approached the table and explained the situation calmly, offering the substitute with confidence. But as soon as the words left her mouth, she saw the change in Richard's face. His brow furrowed. He leaned back in his chair like he'd just been personally insulted. Then, without warning, he slammed his wine glass against the table, hard enough to startle half the room. The noise cut through the restaurant like a siren. He stared at Maya, his voice low but sharp. "You're telling me a place like this doesn't have the wine I asked for?" Maya kept her tone steady. "I completely understand your frustration, sir. It's due to a shipment delay, but..." He didn't let her finish. "You understand," he snapped. "No, I don't think you do. Do you even know who I am?" Time seemed to slow. It wasn't just a question, it was a threat, a reminder of power, a statement meant to put her in her place. He expected her to apologize, to look down, to back off. That's what people usually did. But Maya wasn't most people. She stood tall, looked him directly in the eye, and after a moment of silence she responded. Not with anger, not with sarcasm, but with something stronger than both. "Yes," she said. "I know who you are. But I also know who I am." And in that moment everything changed. Ask ChatGPT. It all began over a wine bottle. Richard Langston, the billionaire tech mogul with a reputation that reached far beyond the boardrooms, had arrived with his entourage at Chateau Noir that evening. He didn't come quietly. He never did. His table had been reserved for weeks in advance. Private booth. Premium menu. High expectations. Everything had to be perfect. And for a man like Richard, perfection wasn't a luxury, it was a demand. He sat with his back straight, his custom suit crisp and flawless. His expensive wristwatch gleamed under the ambient lighting as he waved his hand impatiently for the wine list. Without hesitation he pointed to the most exclusive bottle on the menu. A rare vintage Bordeaux from a boutique French vineyard, priced well into the thousands. It was the kind of wine only a man of his status would casually order without blinking. Maya, the server assigned to his table, accepted the request with her usual professionalism. She knew how to handle demanding customers. She'd served movie stars and moguls. She wasn't new to pressure. But she also knew something Richard didn't. The wine he ordered was unavailable. A supplier error. The shipment had been delayed. The manager had informed all staff at the beginning of the shift, along with a recommendation for a replacement that was nearly identical in profile and quality. So Maya returned to the table, holding her notepad and a composed expression. "Mr. Langston," she began gently, "I wanted to let you know the vintage you requested is currently unavailable due to a shipping issue. However, we do have an excellent substitute, similar in character and highly rated." She spoke with clarity, kindness, and confidence. But Richard didn't like being told no. He paused, squinting at her like she just insulted him. Then slowly, he leaned back in his chair and raised his voice, not just enough for Maya to hear, but loud enough for nearby tables to take notice. "What kind of place runs out of what their menu promises?" he barked, his voice laced with disbelief and irritation. "This is supposed to be the best restaurant in the city, isn't it?" Maya, ever calm, nodded politely. "It absolutely is, sir. And we take that reputation seriously. That's why I'm recommending this alternative, which many of our guests have enjoyed." He cut her off mid-sentence, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "I don't want your recommendations. I want what I asked for." Still Maya kept her tone even. "Unfortunately, sir, we..." Richard interrupted again, this time with sharper words and a louder voice. "You understand? You understand? No, I don't think you do. Do you even know who I am? The entire restaurant seemed to freeze. Forks stopped midair. Conversations at nearby tables halted. The tension radiated from the booth like a heat wave. Staff at the bar turned their heads subtly to listen. The manager, standing near the kitchen entrance, took one quiet step forward, watching closely. Richard leaned forward, his eyes locked on Maya. I could buy this place with pocket change, he said, his voice lower now but dripping with condescension. You people work for tips. I own buildings. Don't come here talking to me like you're doing me a favor. Everyone was watching now, but Maya didn't show it. She didn't glance around. She didn't shrink or stumble. Instead, she stood steady, letting the silence stretch for a few seconds, as if carefully choosing the weight of her next words. She took a breath. Not rushed, not hesitant. And then with calm certainty she responded. Yes, she said quietly. I know who you are. But I also know who I am. It wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It was simple, precise, and devastating. The room went still. Richard's smirk faltered just for a second. He blinked as if trying to decide what had just happened. This wasn't the reaction he was used to. People usually apologized. They scrambled. They folded. But not Maya. Her words echoed louder than his shouting ever could. Because in that moment it was no longer about wine. It was about dignity. About identity. About the way people treat others when they think no one can stop them. She hadn't insulted him. She hadn't retaliated. She had just reminded him, without raising her voice, that he wasn't the only person in the room who mattered. Richard stared at her, jaw slightly clenched. But he didn't speak. Maya didn't flinch. She didn't walk away. She didn't follow up with another sentence to soften the blow. She just waited. Confident. Composed. In control. Eventually Richard looked away. He glanced down at the table, then at his assistant, who was pretending not to panic. Finally he leaned back and muttered. Fine. Bring whatever's closest. The volume in the restaurant began to rise again, slowly and cautiously. Conversations resumed. Forks moved. But everyone who had witnessed the moment remembered it. Maya returned with the replacement wine minutes later, served it with the same grace and professionalism as before, and continued to check on other tables. Her heart was steady. Her hands didn't shake. When her manager approached her discreetly to ask if she was okay, she nodded and smiled. I'm good, she said. And she meant it. That night, Maya finished her shift as she always did, wiping down tables, collecting checks, and saying goodnight to the kitchen staff. She walked home under the stars, her mind not on the billionaire's tantrum, but on her future. Because Maya knew exactly who she was. And that was more powerful than any fortune. Ask ChatGPT. You. With a calm voice and eyes locked on his, Maya replied. Yes, I know who you are. But I also know who I am. Boom. The moment those words left her mouth, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted like the sudden stillness before a thunderstorm. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it landed with the weight of something undeniable, truth. Every sound in the elegant dining room vanished. Forks hovered midair. Conversations halted. Even the soft piano music seemed to fade. The executives at Richard's table stopped breathing for a second. Their eyes darted from Maya to their boss and back again, unsure whether to prepare for an explosion or get up and walk out. Their faces were frozen in that awkward half-expression between disbelief and worry. They had seen Richard crush people with a glance, dismiss entire careers with a nod. They'd seen him curse out interns, bark at assistants, and storm out of boardrooms. But this was new. Richard stared at her. He blinked as if trying to process what had just happened. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, but nothing came out. No comeback. No demand. Just silence. Maya didn't move. She didn't smirk. She didn't flinch. She simply stood with poise, her posture elegant, her eyes steady. She didn't raise her chin in arrogance, nor did she soften her words to cushion his ego. There was no need to add anything. The sentence spoke for itself. That one sentence, just 12 simple words, cut deeper than any insult. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't confrontational. It was powerful. Because it held truth, and truth carries weight. Yes, I know who you are. But I also know who I am. It was the kind of sentence that didn't just respond to a question, it flipped the script. Richard had asked her if she knew who he was, expecting her to be intimidated by his name, his status, his wealth. But she answered in a way that turned the mirror back on him. She acknowledged his identity, but she didn't cower to it. Instead, she asserted her own. In that instant, the hierarchy in the room shifted. Richard may have owned companies and skyscrapers, but Maya owned the moment. For a man like Richard Langston, used to dominance, control, and automatic deference, this was a reality check he didn't expect. All his money, all his power, all the people who jumped when he raised his voice, none of that worked on her. Because Maya wasn't afraid. She didn't need to be. She knew exactly who she was. That truth, the confidence of self-worth, is something no amount of money can buy. It's something many wealthy people spend their lives chasing. But Maya already had it, and it showed. The silence at the table stretched longer than expected. No one dared to interrupt it. There was something sacred about it. Something final. As if everyone knew something had changed, even if they couldn't quite say what. Eventually, Richard leaned back slightly. His gaze broke from Maya's for the first time, his eyes shifting downward for just a moment. It was the first visible crack in his otherwise impenetrable armor. The smirk that usually played on his lips was gone. The superiority in his voice had vanished. For the first time in a very long time, Richard Langston had nothing to say. He glanced toward his assistant, then toward his wine glass. His hand moved slowly, not with the swift, aggressive gestures he had used before, but with quiet acceptance. "Fine," he said, barely above a whisper. "Bring what you have. No thank you. No apology. Just surrender." But even that was enough. Maya nodded and turned gracefully, making her way back to the bar to fetch the replacement bottle. As she walked, there was no dramatic music, no slow clap, no spotlight following her. But there might as well have been. Everyone who had witnessed the exchange watched her go with a kind of quiet admiration. Not because she embarrassed him. Not because she won an argument. But because she showed something so rare in today's world. Grace under fire. In a setting where the rich and powerful often throw their weight around unchecked, Maya had reminded everyone of something vital. That respect isn't something you demand, it's something you give. That self-worth isn't based on a net worth. That sometimes the strongest person in the room isn't the one yelling. It's the one standing still and speaking with calm conviction. Back at the table, Richard sat motionless. His executives still hadn't said a word. They were watching him closely, trying to read the air. Was he going to explode? Would this become a story in the press the next day? But Richard said nothing. When Maya returned with the wine, she poured it gently into his glass, maintaining the same level of professionalism she'd shown from the beginning. Not a trace of ego. No smugness. No hint of revenge. Just the same warm, polished service she gave to every customer. That too was powerful. The rest of the dinner passed in relative quiet. Richard didn't raise his voice again. He ate. He drank. He signed the check without a word. Then he left. But the moment stayed. It stayed with the staff, who talked about it in whispers in the break room. It stayed with the guests who shared the story with friends. And it stayed with Richard perhaps longer than with anyone else. Because Maya hadn't just answered his question. She had reminded him that even someone with all the money in the world could still be humbled. That true power doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from controlling yourself. And as for Maya, she finished her shift that night with the same calm demeanor she always had. She clocked out, tied up her apron, and headed home with the quiet confidence of someone who had stood in the fire and walked through it untouched. She knew who she was. And that made all the difference. Ask ChatGPT. You'd expect a man like Richard Langston to explode after that. A man used to snapping his fingers and having entire rooms bend to his will. A man who'd fired executives for being 5 minutes late. Who had silenced boardrooms with a look, who'd made headlines for walking out of billion-dollar deals simply because someone dared disagree with him. You'd expect that man to lose it, shout, curse, storm out. You'd expect him to punish the person who had dared to speak to him like an equal, especially in public. But surprisingly, he didn't. For a moment he just sat there, staring at Maya as if seeing something unfamiliar. Something he couldn't quite define. His mouth was slightly open, as if about to respond, but no words came out. His eyes didn't hold the usual fire, the practiced arrogance. Instead, they looked distant, disarmed, almost human. It was as though Maya's words had opened a door in his mind that had been locked for years. Like no one had ever spoken to him like that. Not without fear, not without flattery. People either worshipped him or avoided him. They played roles, laughed too hard at his jokes, agreed too quickly with his ideas. But this young woman, standing in front of him in a restaurant uniform, had done something none of them ever had. She'd looked him in the eye and reminded him, in the simplest terms, that titles didn't make someone more important than others. That beneath the money, the fame, the luxury, he was just a man. And she was just a woman. And she wasn't afraid of him. He nodded. Just once. A slow, deliberate motion. And then he spoke, his voice no longer sharp or commanding. "Fair enough," he said. Just like that, the confrontation ended. He turned to his assistant, who looked as stunned as everyone else. "Handle the wine," he said quietly. "No more yelling. No more table slamming." The storm had passed, and what remained was silence and a strange sense of clarity. For the rest of the evening, Richard was quiet. He ate his food. He made small talk. But the energy had shifted. Something had cracked, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. Later that night, after the restaurant had closed, Maya was wiping down a table when her manager approached her. His brow was furrowed with concern, his voice soft. "You okay?" he asked gently. "That guy's got a reputation." Maya gave him a tired but genuine smile. "I'm good," she said simply. And she was. She didn't feel shaken or angry. She didn't feel victorious either. She just felt clear. Like she'd stood for herself without needing to tear anyone down. Like she'd stayed rooted in who she was, even in the face of someone who made others shrink. But the story didn't end there. The next morning, just as Maya was leaving her small apartment for school, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. At first, she thought it was a mistake. No one she knew could afford a car like that. Then a man in a suit stepped out and approached her, holding a sealed envelope with her name on it. He didn't say much. Just smiled politely, handed her the note, and returned to the car, which drove off before she had a chance to ask any questions. She stood there for a moment, puzzled, before opening the envelope. Inside was a short, handwritten note on thick cream paper. The writing was careful, deliberate, elegant. To Maya, "I've spent years surrounded by people who fear me, but none who've challenged me with grace. You reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago, dignity. If you're ever looking for an opportunity, my company has a place for people like you. Richard Langston." She read it twice. She didn't smile or cry, or rush to call someone. Instead, she folded the note neatly and slipped it back into the envelope. It was unexpected, thoughtful, maybe even sincere. But she already knew her answer. Maya didn't take the job. She had other plans. Her goals weren't to climb someone else's ladder, but to build one of her own. She wanted to create something that wasn't shaped by money or ego, but by purpose. Over the next few years, she kept her head down and worked. She graduated from college with honors, then earned a scholarship to a business incubator program. She waited tables less and studied more. She attended pitch competitions, sent out proposals, and met with mentors who believed in her vision. Eventually, she launched her own consulting firm. The mission was simple but powerful: help young entrepreneurs from underserved communities access tools, funding, and mentorship to grow their businesses. Maya knew firsthand how hard it was to break through when the doors of opportunity felt locked. She wanted to hold those doors open for others and teach them how to build their own. Her company gained traction. Clients started showing up. Word of mouth grew. Investors began to pay attention, not because she had flashy marketing or famous endorsements, but because her results were real and her values were unwavering. And then one day, her firm landed a new client. A big one. Langston Enterprises. Not directly from Richard, but from a regional branch looking to invest in community partnerships. When the deal went through, and Maya's team was asked to help with the startup mentorship initiative, she smiled. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a victory lap. It was a full-circle moment. She walked into their headquarters not as a waitress, but as a founder, a leader, and an equal. Richard wasn't there that day, but Maya didn't need him to be. She had already spoken the sentence that changed everything. And she had already proven that knowing who you are, truly knowing it, is more powerful than any amount of money, influence, or fear. Because the world remembers power, but it never forgets dignity. If that story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you love powerful stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Ask ChatGPT.